Blog Talk Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a problem. I would like to introduce
the Bigfoots Pad Paranormal Investigations team.
Oops. 352, Kathleen?
Yes.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, our guest just called into our show. Our guest for tonight is Kathleen Marden. She's a ufologist. She's written several books on UFO phenomenon, most famously known for Capture, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, and Science Was Wrong. And Kathleen on the phone with it's me, Jeremy, and we also have Tim as my co-host.
Okay,
Hi, Kathleen.
hello.
And I was going to say, to get the show started, I was going to ask you, could you talk a little bit about your background and what got you interested in UFOs?
Yes, I would not, I think, have ever become interested in UFOs if it had not been for the fact that I am Betty and Barney Hill's niece. And on September 19, 1961, Betty, who was my mother's oldest sister and my aunt, phoned my home to report that she and my uncle had had a close encounter with a UFO the previous evening. Well, over time, we found out that it had actually been an abduction, became a very famous case through a violation of confidentiality in the beginning. There was a best-selling book written about it, The Interrupted Journey by John Fuller in 1975. The movie UFO Incident starring James Earl Jones and Estelle Parsons was shown on television. It was a made-for-TV movie. So this became a very famous case, but I sort of stayed on the periphery. I was always interested, but I had a professional career. I was a teacher. I was an educational services coordinator. I was also a social worker. I have a background in social science and behavioral science. And it wasn't until about 1990 that I decided to become seriously involved in the study of UFOs and UFO abductions. My primary motivation for doing this was because I wanted to find out for myself if my aunt and uncle had actually had a UFO abduction. I knew that they honestly thought that they had, but I knew also that hypnosis can be a tricky thing. I had studied hypnosis. I'm a certified hypnotherapist. And I knew that perhaps there were being false memories revealed in their separate hypnosis with Dr. Benjamin Simon. And I wasn't sure that they were remembering things as they had occurred. I wanted to study this whole case, to reinvestigate it on my own, to research it, and to find out for myself that it had actually happened. Betty turned all of her files over to me. This was about 40 years of files on her case, all the original reports about the case, the Air Force book reports. Did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was just saying, oh, wow, that's all bad. 40 years worth of stuff is a lot, too.
Yes, it really was. It took me a very long time to go through all of these files and to read everything. The original report that they made to NICAP investigator Walter Webb, who was an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston, who did a lengthy investigation of their case. Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson are two other names that might be familiar to people who have studied this case. They were two employees of IBM. Robert Homan was a writer. C.D. Jackson was a senior engineer. They stayed in communication with Betty and Barney over a number of years. So I had all of these letters and had information about an experiment that I didn't even know was taking place at the time when I was in my late teens. And that was a psychophysics experiment in an attempt to vector in a UFO. And Betty was actually scripted by this team of scientists and engineers to attempt to bring in a UFO. So I had all sorts of fascinating material to go through. Letters to and from scientists. One was very interested in the kind of environment on the planet that these individuals who abducted Betty and Barney might have lived in, based upon their physical description and physical characteristics and behavior. So I found it to be a very fascinating study. In 1996, Betty turned the hypnosis tapes over to me, and I wanted to transcribe them and then to compare Betty's statements to Barney's statements to see how well they matched up. And their statements not only about their abduction, but statements from the very beginning of their experience, from the day that they left on their trip to Niagara Falls and their trip up through Montreal, comparing their statements, looking at Betty's patterns of speech, of the way she described things, and looking at the way that Barney described things to see if those broke down under hypnosis in any way, if this was something that I could refute, that, not that they had intentionally done this, had constructed a story of being abducted, but it was something that was of interest to me as a social scientist and with my background. And in the end, there were some very fascinating results, some which I believe refuted and some which I believe confirmed parts of their experience. So all of this went into the book, captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience. And so that is my background. We have some questions
actually being asked already. I was going to say, sorry if I interrupted you, by the way. Sorry, I didn't.
Oh, no, not a problem.
Oh, well, people were asking specific questions about the incident. People were saying, so Barney, according to the book, said he got out of the car and had a pistol with him?
Yes, he did.
People were asking, do you know if he used the pistol or if he remembers what happened to that, if he had it when they got back?
Yes, I can answer all of those questions. First, let me start with the reason that he had the pistol with him. Barney had gone on a trip to Detroit and had stopped at Niagara Falls with his first wife and two sons. And they ended up not having enough money to stay in a hotel room for the night. They ended up sleeping beside the road. And at that time, Barney wished he had had a pistol to protect his family when he had to do this. Well, they were not robbed or didn't have any problems. But here is Barney. He's married now to Betty, divorced from his first wife. And he is taking Betty on a surprise vacation to Niagara Falls. This previous memory came to him, and he thought, well, this was going to be an impromptu trip. They didn't have a lot of money. Maybe they'd have to stop and sleep beside the road again. And so this time he decided to take the gun with him, and it was actually Betty's pistol. My family was very much interested and into target practice on the family farm, and Betty had bought a pistol for target practice. Now to get to Barney's having that pistol on the trip and for the experience, it was in the trunk of the car. But during their first stop to look at this craft, he went to the trunk and he took the pistol out. That's because he was afraid of bears. They were in bear country. There were picnic barrels nearby. He was walking his dog, and so he took the pistol out for that reason. And he had then put it on the floor of the car. But as he drove south, when he got to the close encounter field, the field where the UFO hovered only about 100 feet above him and above Betty, that is the time that he also had the pistol with him. He left the car, walked into the field after the UFO had shifted to that adjacent field, and he had the gun in his pocket. He tried to pull the gun out. He wanted to shoot at this thing that was frightening him, at the non-human entities that he saw on board the craft, but he wasn't able to do that. He was under some kind of control. Now, when he finally returned to the car, he broke that fear. He broke that hold that that leader had on him, and he ran back to the car and got in. He had probably still had that gun in his pocket. He never mentioned putting it back onto the floor. But later, when he and Betty were actually abducted, that gun was removed from his pocket or wherever it was, because he stated to Dr. Simon during hypnosis that when he was returned to the car and placed in the driver's seat, he sat on the gun. So the gun was not actually taken from him and kept by these ETs who abducted him or whoever they were, but the gun was removed from his jacket and put onto the car seat.
Oh, okay. Well,
I hope that answers the question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we have a lot of questions. You go ahead, Tim. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, sorry if we interrupt every once in a while. We get a lot of callers and a lot of questions through our internet.
Right, feel free, and I can give short answers if you prefer shorter answers. I just wanted to be...
I've been writing these down as they come along. They're kind of a little bit out of order. One of the questions that people are asking are, what did the craft look like in the ETs? Is two of the questions that are being asked a lot.
Okay, what did the craft look like first? It was a disc-shaped craft. There was a lighted row of windows on the forward side of this craft. So it was disc-shaped, it was silent, it hovered. There was an intense blue-white light that shined from these windows. There was a corridor that encircled the interior of the craft on the outside. On the inside, there were wedge-shaped rooms, at least two, because Barney was taken into one and Betty was taken into the other. That forward side of the craft where the windows were is what Betty and Barney saw from the air. But when they were taken onto the craft, they were taken up a ramp on the back side of that circle into a darkened corridor. Apparently the lights had been turned off. Betty was taken into one room, Barney into the other. Each room had an examining table, and it had a cabinet. Now, what did the alien or these beings look like? They were between 4.5 and 5 feet tall, but there was one who was only about 3.5 feet tall. They were wearing black, shiny, tight-fitting uniforms. They were all dressed alike. They had sort of like booties type things on their feet. All of the ones who were 4.5 to 5 feet tall had large wraparound eyes, very, very tiny, tiny nose with sort of upturned nostrils, but almost a completely flat nose. No lips. There was a slit for a mouth. Inside that mouth, or covering that mouth, was a membrane. And when these ETs communicated with each other in kind of a mumbling, kind of bumbling kind of noise, this membrane fluttered. Betty and Barney both mentioned that the membrane flooded. And Betty and Barney understood these beings in English, although it appeared that these beings were not actually speaking to them with mouths in English. They didn't have external ear flaps or lobes or anything like that, just holes, no hair, no nails that Betty and Barney noticed on their bodies. Their skin was a grayish color. They looked, particularly this little one who was about 3.5 feet tall, looked pretty much like what we think today is that stereotypical little gray. And the larger ones were somewhat similar. The heads were not as large in proportion to their bodies as with this little 3.5 foot tall one. So that about describes them, except for I could say that their skeletal system was different from our own. They were sort of oddly jointed. They walked as if they had sea legs. They had barrel-shaped bodies and chests, but they had thin arms and legs. Barney actually called...
Speaking of aliens, a personal question of mine is, do they remember getting taken from the car or going back to the car from the spaceship?
They only remembered that under hypnosis. And yes, they had some conscious recall for a roadblock, men in the road. They always remembered, had a vague memory of men in the road, but they didn't know where or when it happened. Under hypnosis, and they were hypnotized separately by Dr. Benjamin Simon, renowned psychiatrist from Boston, who set up the Mason General Hospital during World War II to treat victims of shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, who were returning from the war front in Europe. And he had a tremendous rate of success in treating these people. So Betty and Barney couldn't have had a better psychiatrist to go to for this hypnosis. He hypnotized them separately. He had sessions with them every week for a period of 6 months, and he imposed amnesia at the end of all of these sessions so that they couldn't even remember what they said, and they couldn't contaminate each other's information because they had no memory for it at the end until he finally let both of them start to remember what they had said and then replayed the hypnosis tapes for them. So getting back to your question about being taken to the craft and being returned to the car, it's interesting because I wanted to know if Betty had merely repeated information in a series of dreams about abduction that she had a couple of weeks after this close encounter in New Hampshire's White Mountains. This was back in '61. So I lined up Betty's statements and Barney's statements to what Betty wrote had occurred in her dreams, because perhaps Barney had just absorbed this information from Betty's dreams and repeated it under hypnosis. Perhaps Betty had simply repeated her dreams under hypnosis. This is something I wanted to know. And what I found out is that in this period where they were actually abducted and these beings were in the road, the car stalled, the headlights went out, Betty, in her dreams, said that they sat there quietly. They were silent. They didn't move. But both Betty and Barney, under hypnosis, stated to Dr. Simon that they attempted to escape. They first talked about what it was. They were confused. Was there an accident ahead? Were they being robbed? What were these men doing in the road? They just were perplexed by this. But as these men approached the car, Barney said to Betty, "I think it's the ones I saw when I was standing in the field." And at that point, they were able to see that they were not human, and they both panicked. And Betty grabbed for the door handle. She wanted to get out of that car and run into the woods and hide. Barney thought about going for his gun. He decided that he might be harmed if he did, so he didn't. But he opened the car door and he stepped out. 3 approached Barney's door, 3 approached Betty's door, and took them out of the car. All of this information that Betty and Barney gave independently under hypnosis was not in Betty's dream material. Yet Betty and Barney both stated that this happened to them, even down to the number of abductees, abductors, captors that there were there. So this gave me a clue that part of this experience at least really did happen. Same thing is true when they were returned to the car. In Betty's dreams, she wrote that they were returned together, and the leader told them they could stand by the car and watch the craft leave. That didn't happen under hypnosis. Under hypnosis, Barney was returned to the car first. They put him into the car, and that's when he sat on the gun. They had a dog with them, their little dachshund, Delcy, who was under the seat and shivering and shaking down there. And Barney reached down and picked Delcy up and put her on the seat. Betty stated that she was back on the craft because she wanted some evidence to take with her that this was a real experience, that the leader had told her that she could take something that resembled a book that she found in the examining room. So the crew then came and said that she couldn't keep the book. So she stood there arguing, insisting that she needed it, that this was her proof that it happened. And so this took a few minutes, and then the leader took her down the ramp and returned her to the vehicle. And then, at that point, they got out and they watched the craft leave.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because I've heard the story. I'm sorry, I've heard the story many times. I never heard about the book part, though, at the very end there.
Oh, you didn't? Yeah.
Oh, no, that's the only part I've never heard before. That's pretty neat stuff.
Yes, and it wasn't actually a book as we think of books. It was large. It was kind of a thick material that reminded Betty of plastic, and there was some kind of script that she had never seen before on Earth that was sort of embedded into the plastic in this page on the book that she looked at. There were 6 columns, and they appeared to be written vertically in vertical columns. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, and we're actually getting another question right now. Someone wants to know, does this take place along Route 3 in central New Hampshire, or does it take place along another route in New Hampshire, if you knew the answer?
Well, the actual sighting and close encounter took place on Route 3. That was the major north-south route through New Hampshire in that time frame. Interstate 93 had only been constructed as far north as about Northfield, Tilton, in that area, for people who are familiar with New Hampshire. If not, you can pull out a map. They stopped for the first time just south of Twin Mountain. Betty had sighted the craft for the first time outside Lancaster, but she didn't realize that there was anything unusual about it when she first saw it, only that it appeared to be a falling star, only it flew upward instead of the way a falling star normally does, and it had stopped by the moon. Well, so then they continued from Twin Mountain through the area called Franconia Notch. Anyone who has been a tourist in New Hampshire is probably familiar with Franconia Notch. It's where the Old Man of the Mountain used to be located. That's New Hampshire's state symbol. It fell off the mountain in 2003, unfortunately. And the flume is in Franconia Notch, and Cannon Mountain, where there is a tramway that goes to the top of the mountain. So it's a beautiful area, a narrow gorge, high mountains for people to visit. The Close Encounter field was in North Lincoln at the entrance, the south entrance to Franconia Notch. And this is where the cabins and the motels and the hotels start, and the more commercialized tourist activities. So the Close Encounter field was there. It was not a heavily populated area in 1961, the way it is now, and this happened during the off-season. So there wasn't anyone else around when it happened. Now, Betty and Barney, after they heard a series of beeping or buzzing sounds, these were code-like sounds that seemed to bounce off the trunk of their vehicle, and it caused their car to vibrate, and it caused a kind of a weird tingling sensation to pass through their bodies. The next thing after this happened is they remembered under hypnosis is that all of a sudden they were in a new location. They had never been there before. They didn't know where they were. They were on Route 3 one moment, and the next moment they were on a different road. There were tall trees all around. Now, they later discovered that this other road was Route 175. It's a state highway, and it runs parallel to Route 3. And a side road off from Route 175 is Millbrook Road. And Millbrook Road was the dirt logging road in 1961 where the abduction actually took place. It was in Thornton, New Hampshire. And I am going to be posting a guide on my website at www.Kathleen, Kathleen, -Marden, MARDEN.com. I have written actually a travel guide that anyone can download. It's not posted yet. I have to get to doing that. There are other articles that you can read, or you could purchase my books at my website as well. But if anyone is going there on vacation, my email address is also there, so you can contact me, and I can just send a copy of the guide to you through email so that you will have it and you can follow it if you are going to that area and you want to retrace the Hills route. It's interesting that next September of 2011 marks the 50th anniversary of Betty's and Barney's abductions. And the Indian Head Resort in North Lincoln is going to be having a big celebration. I'm going to be up there, and I'm going to lecture, and I'm going to do guided tours of the encounter route. And there's also going to be a memorial dedicated to the memory of Betty and Barney. So that should be a good event.
That sounds pretty neat.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Well, I have a quick question. You said that they woke up and when they came to, you said that they were a couple miles away from where they originally last remembered before they got abducted?
Well, let me clarify that. They had actually conscious recollection of hearing the buzzing sounds, and then they were 30 miles south, as if only an instant had passed. They had this 2-hour period of missing time with no recollection for what happened. It was under this separate hypnosis with Dr. Simon that each of them said that immediately after this first series of buzzing sounds, they found themselves on a different road. And then they found themselves, without knowing why, turning on to that logging road. And the aliens were in the road.
Well, people were asking, does that mean that, what the question is, it says, does that mean that the spaceship or the aliens moved them and the car somewhere else? Is what the question was?
You know, that's a very good question, and I don't think there's a clear answer to that. I had speculated that perhaps the magnetic spots that were on the trunk of Betty's and Barney's car when they arrived home, these were 12 to 18 highly polished concentric circles on the trunk of their car that caused the compass needle to spin and spin. Well, I speculated, well, maybe the craft had actually picked their car up and moved it. But, of course, there's no proof that happened. It could be that these beings simply guided the car some way, remotely or from a distance, or it could be that they had taken over Barney's mind in some way. Barney did state to Dr. Simon that he made a turn, and he did not know why he had to make that turn. So it sounded like he had to do this without wanting to do it. And so,
well, another question that I was actually wondering myself, so I never knew they had the dog with them. What happened to the dog? Did anything weird happen to it?
Well, the dog did respond to this craft. She was up on the back seat with her paws up on the ledge when the craft was behind the car. And over the car, she's looking up. With these beeping or buzzing sounds, her ears went up in the air like she was listening. Of course, she was terrified. She was shivering and shaking when Betty and Barney returned to the car. When she arrived home with Betty and Barney, her behavior changed. Betty said that she it was almost as if she was having nightmares, that her little legs would run. She'd be asleep, and she'd wake Betty up with her whimpering and yelping, and her legs would be running. And she also developed a fungus infection on her skin. So those are a number of different things that happened to the dog, but as far as anyone knows, they didn't take the dog. Maybe they did. Who knows?
Well, from your book, I was going to say about the star map. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. Well, the story behind the star map is that when there was only one examiner on board the craft. He examined Betty, and then he went into the examining room to examine Barney. And when he was examining Barney, Betty was left alone in her room with the leader. And she had, at that point, lost her fear of him. She was terrified initially, but when they did a very, very painful procedure on her that was like a laparoscopy, when they did that, he took her pain away. So she lost her fear of him. So she's in the room with him alone. There's time to wait for Barney's exam to be completed, And she says to the leader, I know you're not from around here. Where are you from? And he produced a three-dimensional map. He did something to the wall, and this map appeared. And on that map were dots. Some were as large as nickels, and some were the size of pinpoints. And connecting those circles and dots, not all of them, but some of them, were lines. There were two in the foreground that were the size of nickels, and they were connected by 5 lines. There were lines that went out to others. There were 3 lines to one, 2 lines to others, and then there were some that were only dotted lines. And the leader stated to Betty that some were trade routes, the solid lines were trade routes, the dotted lines were expeditions. Dr. Simon gave Betty the post-hypnotic suggestion that when she returned home after her hypnosis session, if she could remember what she observed on board the craft accurately and that it didn't cause her too much trouble, she would be able to draw it. And she actually did go home and she drew it. And it was in the first book that was written by John G. Fuller, The Interrupted Journey, and that was released in the fall of 1966. Well, a very smart woman from the state of Ohio read John Fuller's book. Her name was Marjorie Fish. She was a school teacher. She had her bachelor's degree in sociology. And she was also a member of Mensa, meaning that she had a genius-level IQ. She was single, and this gave her a project to work on. She reasoned that if the people really came from this star system, that or these stars, that she might be able to find out where they came from. So she started building 3-dimensional models of our galaxy. She started going out so many light years, and she wouldn't be able to get a match. And so she'd try again. She ended up building 26 3-dimensional models using Betty's 2-dimensional drawing. And the great difficulty in doing all of this was that they didn't have computers at the university then. They didn't have Xerox machines, so she couldn't even copy the information. She couldn't just go and pick up the astronomy catalog she was using. She had to go to the astronomy department at the university and borrow their catalogs and record all of the distance data by hand. And she wasn't only looking at distances, she was also looking at the characteristics of these stars, of these suns. Could they support life? Did we believe they could support life? So finally, she worked on these and worked on them. She couldn't get a match. But finally, in 1972, after several years of working on this, a new star catalog came out, a new Gliese catalog. And there were stars in there that we hadn't known about when Betty drew that map. And Marjorie then was able to find a pattern, and she that was out 54 light years, and all of the stars on Betty's map were in that pattern 54 light years out, and they were all sun-like stars, believed to possibly have planets at that time. The distances have changed a little bit since then, but the base stars on that map were Zeta Reticuli, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2. And they are very much like the sun. Zeta 1, it has 93% of our sun's mass. It's 91% the diameter, 79% the luminosity. It has an abundance of iron, and it might be 2 or 3 billion years older than the sun.
Oh, dang.
Same with Zeta 2, 99% the diameter of our sun, 102% luminosity. It also has an abundance of iron. So they're very much like our sun. And they have these characteristics that lead some astronomers to believe that these beings who are coming here might be coming from there. And if Betty's map was accurate, we know that Marjorie's work was accurate because it was vetted by the head of the astronomy department at Ohio State University, and also by the head of the astronomy department at Northwest University, Allen J. Hynek, or J. Allen Hynek, I mean. So, and they said that her work was accurate. So
that's pretty interesting.
Very intriguing.
One of my personal questions was, I seen a show on the History Channel a couple years ago, and it was talking about a liquid or a powder on Betty's dress. I was going to say, do you know about if there's any updates on that, if they found out what it was or what it could be?
Yes, I was on that show, actually, and they went out to Phyllis Budinger's laboratory in Chagrin Falls, Ohio. She's the one who did the analysis on the dress, with some very interesting anomalous findings. I might add that television program wasn't entirely accurate because there were anomalous findings on Betty's dress. But let me say that we have not been able to have any more updates done. This testing is very, very expensive. We have to find a scientist who is able to get the research funding or able to fund the project himself or herself to do more extensive testing on the dress. So far, no one has been able to identify what that pink powdery substance on Betty's dress is.
Well, we have about 18 minutes, and I was going to say, trying to look at some of the questions. One question that somebody asked us was, do you know if there's any interesting facts that people get wrong or mixed up all the time with the case?
There are loads of facts that people get wrong with this case. You can just go online and read different stories that people state, and then compare it to what Stanton Friedman and I have written in Captured: The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, because our book is based upon the factual information in the text. It was vetted not only by Stan, but by several other individuals, some with PhDs, for accuracy. Some of the things that are said are that Betty and Barney remembered nothing more than seeing a light in the sky until Betty had the dreams, which is totally false. They had conscious recollection for a close encounter with the craft. Barney had conscious recall for observing non-human entities on board the craft. It's all in Walter Webb's first report. The craft hovered only about 100 feet over their vehicle. It's in the report they made to Pease Air Force Base the day they arrived home. So that's one huge misconception. Another one is that they only, I'd already said it, they only saw a star-like object. Barney became nervous and took turned off from the main highway onto narrow mountain winding roads and probably became lost for a couple of hours. That's nonsense, too. He had no intention of turning off Route 3. If you have a craft, an extraterrestrial craft, or something that you know is not conventional, and it's threatening you, and it's hovering over your car, are you going to turn onto a narrow, winding mountain road in order to try to escape it, or are you going to stay on the main highway hoping to find a police officer? Barney stated over and over again he hoped that he would find a police officer, and that's what he did. Someone has written that Betty and Barney observed the tower, the light on the tower on the top of Cannon Mountain, and that's what all of this was. Go up there and take a look for yourself. You will realize that it definitely wasn't, and that most of Betty's and Barney's close encounter occurred south of that area. People have said that Betty was a lifelong fan of science fiction and UFOs. That's also false. It's been said that Barney watched the Bolero Shield on television on The Outer Limits, and that he got his description of the beings on board the craft as a result of watching Outer Limits. Big problem with that is that he gave the description of what these beings were wearing to Walter Webb in October of 1961. The show was on Outer Limits in February of 1964. So there really has been a tremendous amount of misinformation. And that is the reason that I decided to write Captured. I wanted to set the record straight and separate fact from fiction and fantasy from reality in all of this.
Do you think that there'll be a follow-up book, or you think that you put most of your information in that one?
I put most of the essential information in this one. I have a lot more files, and occasionally I write a magazine article. So there will probably be magazine articles that will be a follow-up to this. I don't know if I'll ever write another book on that topic or not. I pretty well covered it. There was a lot of information there that I just simply could not put in. There were, copyright issues for one thing. But here and there, you'll find all of the information.
Well, we had Stanton Friedman on our show a couple times in the past, and one thing that he always liked that we asked him, and I thought that I would ask you, what happened to Betty and Barney after the story got out? Like, were they like I wouldn't say celebrities, but you know what I'm trying to say? Like, were they popular, or were people not believing them, or what happened?
Well, let me tell you, this story was supposed to be confidential. It was never going to be released. Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. She and Barney were active in the civil rights movement. Barney was legal redress on the NAACP. He was also on the regional board. He was chairman of the board of directors for the Rockingham County Community Action Program that he and Betty helped to found in Portsmouth. He had been appointed by the governor of the state of New Hampshire to serve on the state advisory board for the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, answering to the President of the United States. And he had also campaigned for Lyndon Johnson and been a delegate at Johnson's inauguration. The three of us actually went to the inauguration. So Betty and Barney had everything to lose and nothing to gain by having this story made public. They were contacted by a newspaper reporter from Boston in August of 1965. He'd heard about their story 3 through a violation of confidentiality, someone who lived in his town, who knew about the case, who was supposed not to talk about it, did talk about it. And he got a lot of information. Betty and Barney refused to cooperate with him. They begged him not to write the story. They said they'd lose their jobs. They refused to meet with him. And they thought that they were home free because the story initially wasn't published. Yet, on October 25th, 1965, that same year, a couple of months later, for 5 nights in a row, the story appeared in the Boston Traveler. And it was just devastating to our family, to Betty and Barney. Fortunately, they didn't lose their jobs. They thought they would. Barney worked at the post office. They didn't lose their jobs. And they were really surprised initially at the positive response they received. Many people came forward and told them about their own close encounters with UFOs, about the craft that had landed on their farms. So Betty and Barney knew that they weren't alone in this close encounter, but maybe they were alone in the abduction. But it was only a small group of very vocal debunkers who gave Betty and Barney kind of a hard time over all of this. The general public was much more accepting than they thought they would be. And did they become popular? They became famous over this, particularly after the book was published. They decided to cooperate with John G. Fuller, and Dr. Simon did as well, to tell the whole story. It had already been told in the Boston Traveler. It had gone out all over the country, all over the world. But the story that John Luttrell told wasn't entirely accurate. Betty and Barney decided to tell the accurate story, the true account. And John Fuller transcribed some of their hypnosis tapes. Dr. Simon cooperated in all of this and sort of oversaw what was published in the book, too. He was very, very strict about what he would permit to be said in this book. And so the book was published. It became a New York Times bestseller. Betty and Barney went on a book promotion tour of the United States. They were on many television shows. And then Barney died suddenly in 1969. Only a little, not too long. The book was published in the fall of 66. That gives us 67, 68. And in February of 69, he was dead. But massive cerebral hemorrhage. But Betty went on, and the movie was made. She eventually retired from her job as a social worker with the welfare department. She had been promoted to the position of intake and referral supervisor for the state welfare department. But she retired, and she started to investigate UFOs on her own and became quite well known for that as well.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left in the show, and I have one more question. I was just curious, how often did they talk about the experience, like your family and when you would talk to them?
When I was a kid, we talked about it. We were fascinated. This was something that we didn't know existed. And this happened to family members. Initially, Betty and Barney were very curious, but they were troubled by what had happened to them as well, this 2-hour period of missing time. But we were all sworn to secrecy. We're a close family, so we were all there to support Betty and Barney and to help them sort of come to terms with what actually happened with this close encounter. And when they would gain more information from in UFO investigators or reporters, or I shouldn't say reporters, researchers, UFO researchers, who were holding all this information confidential, they would let us know, too. So we would learn a little bit more about UFOs and what these investigators knew about UFOs. So, yes, I knew about this from day one, from the day they returned. I was 13 years old and overheard my mother's conversation with Betty. Within 2 days, my family traveled the 20 miles from my house in Kingston, New Hampshire, to Betty and Barney's house in Portsmouth. And we sat in the living room and heard Betty and Barney describe what happened to them with this close encounter. We saw that their watches were broken. Their watches worked perfectly fine. They checked them at 10 o'clock on the night of their encounter. Betty checked hers again as she was going by Cannon Mountain at 11:20 that evening. Their watches were broken when they arrived home. They didn't realize it at first. They thought they'd just stopped. They wound them. They never worked again. I saw the spots on the trunk of the vehicle. The tops of Barney's shoes, these were his best dress shoes, were deeply scraped. They weren't just scuffed. Those toes were scraped. He had to wear them for yard work after that. He was a meticulous dresser and wouldn't go out in public in those shoes again. And then Betty's dress was torn. The zipper had a 2-inch tear at the top on one side, a 1-inch tear on the other side. The lining was torn from waist to hemline. The hem was torn down on one side. It was a fairly new dress. She had only, as far as she knew, been riding in the car that day between Montreal and her house in New Hampshire. She'd gotten out to eat a couple of times. She'd gotten out to observe this craft, but she and Barney weren't aware of having been abducted, but they had all of this weird physical evidence that they couldn't explain. So it was really perplexing, not just to them, but to the family. And then they had some pretty bizarre events that happened, sort of paranormal events that had never taken place in my family before that, but started to occur not only in their house, but in my childhood home as well. Doors were sliding back and forth. There were light orbs. There were multiple witnesses, not just in our family, who saw this. There was a UFO that landed in my grandparents' field, in their farm, and was observed by a neighbor who was a commercial pilot as he was returning home from work in the middle of the night. It woke my grandparents up. It shook the house. It woke my brother up. My brothers and I went out and found the landing area and the physical trace evidence the following day. It was analyzed. So when I was a teenager, all of this was going on, and it was pretty fascinating, but a little bit frightening as well.
Wow, that is pretty neat, because I know, again, I've had paranormal experiences too, and I know how, like you said, I'm more along the lines where it's more neat than scary.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I think I wrote in great detail about all of these things in Captured.
Oh, do you? Yeah, because I haven't been to the bookstore in a while, but next time I stop by, we'll have to pick up Captured, and I believe your other one was called Science Was Fake, right, ma'am?
Science Was Wrong.
Wrong, there you go.
The science was wrong. Startling truths about cures, theories, and inventions they declared impossible. It's about discoveries that have been made in science, very important discoveries during the past 150 years or so, that were initially said to be invalid or fraudulent. The inventors or the discoverers were often called charlatans, and a lot of times there was a consequence to society too in all of this. Sometimes thousands of people died as a result of this denial of truth. So that's what that book is about. We have a couple of chapters on UFOs and also a chapter on psi phenomena in that book, as well as a lot of other fascinating chapters on medical science, politics, aviation, communication. So it was a lot of fun writing that book.
Our show actually is ready to end in about a minute. I was going to say, is there any links or any things like that you would like to say before we end the show? Absolutely, yes. Please visit my website at www.Kathleen, Kathleen, hyphen, that's a dash, Marden, MARDEN.com. Both of my books, autographed copies of my books with Stanton Friedman, are for sale there. You can purchase them using PayPal. So you get both of our autographs. I also have some articles there that you might be interested in reading. And some of them are some information that is specifically not encaptured, but is new information that I've discovered since I wrote the book. And from time to time, I post more information on my website as well. I've been pretty busy writing, though, and haven't had a chance to post everything that I want. But I will be adding more to it over the winter, probably. And again, I would like to thank everybody that asked questions. I'd like to thank you again, Kathleen, for going on the show. Well, it was my pleasure. And thanks for asking. We do have a lot of questions still. We'll have to do another show sometime in the future, sometime soon. Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Kathleen. You take care. You too. Yes, thanks again, Kathleen. Have a good night.